Welkom bij deze super speciale Learn Podcast aflevering. De 67e aflevering in het Engels, maar je moet absoluut blijven luisteren, want we hebben namelijk niemand minder dan Dylan Wiliam te gast. En we praten over van alles. We praten over AI, we praten over feedback, we praten over curriculum, nieuwe curricula, over grote doelen, kleine doelen en ook over inspectie. Dus van alles komt langs. En ja, dit moet je gewoon beluisterd hebben. Dus welkom bij de 67e aflevering van de Learn Podcast. In education, the name Dylan Wiliam is really a big thing, and you've done so many things as well. You were a researcher, you taught for so many years, you were an evaluator, you were an advisor, you gave so many presentations to so many teachers. And I was just wondering, what moves you the most when you are in a classroom or when you visit a classroom or when you were still teaching? In that classroom, what moves you? What drives you in education, and what moves you when you see those students in the classroom?
I just like being with young people. I just find their ideas interesting. I just like seeing them grow and develop. And, I've gone back over my career and I think, where can I have most impact? And I thought when I was a teacher, maybe if I was a head of department, maybe if I trained teachers, maybe if I researched. I'm now not so sure. I think I might have more impact if I went back into the classroom and just worked with students regularly on a day-to-day basis. But I'm 70 years old now, and I don't think I've got the energy for that anymore. But just working with young people is just so enjoyable. When I get into schools, I just love to talk to them and hear what they're thinking about the work that they're doing. And as a second best to that, it's working with teachers. So working with teachers, helping them understand what the research says and what it doesn't say. And also, I think restoring their professional judgment, because too often we hear research as being used to hit teachers over the head. You're not doing this. And of course, when you go and ask the research those big questions, the research actually says basically two things. It's complicated and it depends. And so what I'm trying to do is to carve out a role for teacher professional judgment. Yes, if there's research there, we should use it. But very often there's no research there, and therefore teachers' professional judgment is probably the best source of good advice.
And if you look back, like when you published Inside the Black Box and where you are now, like how has your thinking changed over the years? And is there something that you know now that you didn't know then, that you would have wanted to know back then? How has your thinking over time changed when looking back to when you published Inside the Black Box?
I spoke to Paul Blank about this about 10 years ago. And we were just saying that if we'd realized how hard this was going to be, we might have done something else. So I don't think my view of what makes a good classroom has changed very much. I started teaching in the 1970s, where we used a scheme where each individual student has their own program of work. And so I was doing formative assessment. I didn't call it that at the time, because I didn't decide what a student was going to do next until I saw how they did with the last piece of work. So my view of what makes a good classroom hasn't changed. I think what we didn't really understand is how hard it is to change that at scale. So in 1999, after Inside the Black Box, we worked with some teachers face-to-face. We have, I think, 6 one-day workshops with those teachers over a year. And we saw that eventually their practice began to change. But working face-to-face with 24 teachers is not a scalable model. So the last 20 years has really been about trying to figure out how to scale this up, how to do this not just in 24 classrooms, but in 2 million classrooms. And I think we've made some progress. And now we're hitting the political issues, just the difficulty of reforming a system where people are invested in what they already do, or they just don't believe that the answers are appropriate and they've got some other ideas about what classrooms should be like.
And so what is the thing that you changed to make it more scalable to 2 million schools in the last year? So what kind of developments have you seen or are you doing?
So this is the work I started at Educational Testing Service in 2003. This idea of effective, scalable teacher professional development. Obviously, if we could have every teacher getting a coach, that'd be a good idea. But coaching is very vulnerable to shifts in funding. And B, I'm not sure you can find good enough coaches. So we developed this idea of the teacher learning community. The idea that the teachers in a school would become their own coaches, that they would actually hold each other accountable. And over time, that model expanded. It's been implemented in dozens of countries. And it was clearly kind of working, but we didn't know if it was working. And that's why that large randomized controlled trial done by the Education Endowment Foundation in England was so important, because it showed that across 70 high schools, when teachers were doing this, their students did better, even when the achievement was measured on external standardized tests. So that, I think, is the important breakthrough. We now know that this works even when you measure student achievement on externally mandated standardized tests that are scored by somebody outside the school. So, the other point I think that's really important is to take into account the cost effectiveness. So there's lots of things we can do, like helping teachers unpack standards that may have some impact on student achievement, but they're incredibly labor intensive. And there's a belief in the United States, for example, that professional development must be subject specific. And I think that's just not true. And even if you do it on particular content, you might well improve the teaching of that content, but you aren't going to improve the teaching of any other content. So that's why I focus on pedagogy, because if you improve teachers' pedagogy, they can use it everywhere. And so the really important thing for me when I talk to school leaders is, let's say you could find 25 hours of professional development time for every teacher in your school. What use of that 25 hours is going to have the biggest impact on outcomes for students? And I think if you're answering any other question, you're basically irrelevant, because we could always wish for better teachers. We could wish for more motivated students. We'd wish for more hours in the day, but the time we have is the time we have. What use of that time is going to be of most benefit to students? It's focusing relentlessly on that. And I think we've shown that helping teachers make their classrooms more formative in their practice is the most cost-effective thing you can do. Just to quantify that, a 20 to 25% increase in the rate of student progress by changing how teachers spent 2% of their time at a cost of roughly €1.5 to €2 per student per year.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know anything that comes even close to that in terms of benefit to students.
Yeah, so for me, like, one of the interesting things about formative assessment is that there's also sort of a double loop. So we say we use formative assessment to create more learning for our students, but I think it also has a huge effect on the learning of teachers.
Yeah.
Because, you get feedback on your teaching through formative assessment.
Yeah. And this is the argument that John Hattie keeps on making, is that it's, the most important feedback is from students to teachers. And I think that's helpful. I just don't call it feedback. I just call it information. But the point is, there is this loop. And I think we've seen this so many times. Teachers realizing that for most of their career, they've been making decisions on the basis of very poor quality evidence. And so I was just rereading some of the interviews we did with the first 24 teachers in England. And they were saying they have to recalibrate their expectations of what they could actually cover in a lesson, because now they were finding out the students didn't get it. And they felt obliged to do something about it once they had that information. They'd previously been saying, everybody okay with that? Great, and moving on. And so it just changed. And what is interesting is once you get that sense, you can't go back. So I've done interviews with teachers where they say, I now feel uncomfortable if I haven't got some information from the students about the sense they're making of what I'm saying. Because they just, how do I know this is having the right effect? And just that shift from what I'm putting into the process to what the students are getting out of it. And then that other shift from listening for the correct answers to listening for the meaning in students' responses. Once you get those shifts happening in teachers, they never go back to how they were before. They just completely change. Things like wait time. I can't bear to be in a lot of classrooms just because I'm so aware of how little time children have to think. And, I don't find it difficult to do long wait time now because it's just part of who I am as a teacher. I'm so aware that other students don't get that time to think. And therefore, we don't get the best out of our students because we don't give them a chance. Valentina.
Do you think then, of course, the AI thing is in the room, right? So AI is everywhere and everybody's talking about AI. And this morning I was reading on LinkedIn a blog post from somebody who wrote that AI was especially going to help teachers with formative assessment. And he was making a plea for it, but I was not really convinced. I could see the possibilities there. And I know you can use AI maybe to help you design good questions or maybe help AI give feedback to more students. But still, my daughter the other day was really frustrated when she noticed that the feedback she got was actually with AI and not from her teacher because she had put so much effort into her, written work. So it's such a complicated thing. And it just came to my mind because you were talking about, improving teachers and the cost effect and how many hours you have and, the expenses, the limited expenses that they are. So how can we give AI a right place in this complex thing of education and also in relation to formative assessment, but without using the very essential and necessary human interaction?
Well, for me, whether the human interaction is necessary is an empirical question. So some of my colleagues say AI will never replace teachers. I don't know that. I am very aware of, in the past, I've said AI will never be able to do this, and then suddenly it's doing it. So I'm a lot more cautious than a lot of my colleagues about saying AI will never be able to do this. But first of all, Craig Bartlett's done some very nice work on using AI, and it's helpful for producing diagrams, but only where the teacher's in charge of the concepts. So he did a nice paper, a nice blog on using AI to generate questions on misconceptions. And some of them were just terrible. And if you didn't have the expertise yourself, you wouldn't know they were terrible. So I think the teacher needs still to be in charge. I think that we can probably expect to see AI generating feedback, but we have to keep the teacher in the loop. So one interesting application is to have AI tidy up the teacher's comments, make them a bit less blunt, which saves the teacher time. AI may be suggesting 2 or 3 different things to say to the student, and the teacher chooses which one would be right for that student, knowing what you know about that student. We've also seen AI improving online tutoring. So there's the Tutor Copilot developed by people at Stanford University, which actually made relatively inexperienced online tutors, almost as good as experienced ones. And then you've also got the stuff that's been done with Craig Bartlett's ED team and Google's Learn LM team, where the large language model suggests feedback to the student. The teacher then vets it and then maybe tweaks it, and then it goes to the student. And so the interesting thing was 75% of the prompts suggested by the AI were not changed by the teacher. And the average change that the teachers produced of the ones they changed was about 70 characters, 10 words. So we're getting there. And I think we are going to be making progress, provided we keep the human in the loop. The place where I really think AI is going to have an impact on formative assessment is in teacher coaching. So I've been working with a company called Aristotle, and they actually give teachers feedback on their own formative assessment practice. So the idea is the teacher uploads a transcript or audio file of their lesson and asks the AI for feedback. And teachers have said it's the best feedback they've ever got, particularly science specialists. Because often when a physics teacher gets coaching from somebody else in the school, that person doesn't know enough about physics to be really helpful. And they're saying it's the best feedback they've ever had. So the important thing for me is, first, it's private. It's not the rector's spy in your classroom. It is actually you choosing to get some feedback on bits of your practice that you particularly want help with. And I think that's probably going to be the major contribution. Places where I missed an opportunity to develop students' ideas, missed an opportunity to find ideas from different students, and that kind of thing I think will be genuinely helpful. But certainly my initial position is there should be no student-facing AI in primary and secondary classrooms. That it needs to go through a human before we let it loose anywhere near children.
We've just rewritten our national curriculum, and we try to do three things at once: make it more concrete, more coherent, and less overloaded. And what the national curriculum organization did was they tried to cut the number of goals and bundling them into bigger ones. And you argue that those kinds of aims are not targets to hit, but they are rather values that pull against each other. So can a curriculum be more concrete and more coherent at the same time? Or is one of those being traded for the other without anyone actually saying so?
I think it can be more coherent and more concrete, provided you don't expect to cover quite so much. So I think that the principle, as you said, that I've tried to outline is there's going to be trade-offs in any curriculum. And the question is, are those trade-offs explicit? Because we argue about them and we decide that this one is more important than that one? Or do they emerge as unintended consequences? And so people talk about the law of unintended consequences. And I don't think there's any such law. There's no such thing as the law of unintended consequences. Unintended consequences are the result of failure to think things through in enough detail. And so my argument is, for any change, what will be better if we make these changes, and what will be worse if we make these changes? And if anybody says nothing will be worse, then they're not thinking it through. They're not serious, so ignore them. So for me, the real problem is it's basically a cognitive human brain problem, which is that some students learn faster than others. And I'm not sure we know exactly how much, because our current education systems clearly advantage the faster learners. So we're probably getting a bigger range of achievement than we could have if we didn't alienate so many learners who give up because they don't feel they're successful. So I don't think the spread of achievement we've got now is necessary, but there's certainly a difference in the speed at which students learn. And the question is, what do you do in terms of the curriculum, given that fact? And right now, most curriculums around the world try to put in enough material to keep the fastest learning students busy for the whole year, which means there's way too much for everybody else. And I quite like Robert Barzano's idea of a guaranteed and viable curriculum. So a curriculum is guaranteed if every student, say in 6th grade, experiences this. And it's viable if every student in 6th grade learns this. And so if we're going to have a guaranteed and viable curriculum, we need far less content than we have. And people say, well, you're not pushing the higher achievers. No, the government isn't pushing those higher achievers. The teachers in the schools can decide what additional material to put in to stretch those higher achievers. As soon as you say that everybody has to get the curriculum designed for the highest achievers, you guarantee a bad experience for the lower achievers, the slower learners. And so I think that the crucial first step is saying, no, we're not going to put everything out. We're going to put things that we think are really important, and we're going to leave out a lot of stuff that's really very, very interesting, because you can't do everything. And so that's the principle of parsimony. And we're not dumbing down. What we're saying is we're making choices that reflect the need to have every student experiencing success in school so that they carry on learning when they leave. And I think this is something that I've changed my mind about in the last probably 10 years. I used to think that the level of achievement was really important. And I still think it's kind of important, but it's not as important as students leaving us at the age of 18 with the same passion and curiosity for learning that they had when they came to us at the age of 5. If we alienate our learners, no matter how much we teach them, we'll have failed them, because most of what they need for the rest of their lives hasn't been discovered or invented yet. So it's that need to maintain student interest and curiosity. And I'd be quite prepared to trade off a bit of achievement in order to secure more motivated learners. And that's why I'm less critical of the work of people like Jo Bola than many of my colleagues, because she's focusing on those students believing they can be mathematicians. And, that might not result in such high achievement at the age of 18, but it might result in far higher achievement at the age of 35. So, we have to think about the discounting effects here as well. And so for me, it's all these trade-offs between coverage and depth, about short-term versus long-term effects. And we need to be brave and say, we're not going to teach everything. We're going to leave stuff out. And doing that in a principled way, I think, helps us have the right conversations about what is and was not important. Interestingly, Jerome Bruner thought this through 60 years ago. He said, is it important? In other words, will it harm the adult that this child will become if they do not learn this? And the second question is, will it harm the adult this child will become if they do not learn it now? And if the answer to that question is no, then it's cluttering up the curriculum. If you're going to leave it without harming the adult the child will become, then maybe it's better to do it later when the student is able to learn more quickly. So I think those kinds of trade-offs can be very helpful, and leaving stuff out to focus on more stuff in depth. Then you can have coherence and depth and student engagement and student agency. The problem is, right now, we cover everything and demotivate our students because they feel like failures.
Yeah. So would also a spiral curriculum, could that be a good way to help those low achievers? Because I've been reading a lot about spiral curriculums, but I also think it's hard to find good examples of what that might look like in practice. So
the idea is always associated with Jerome Bruner, and the thing I just told you comes from a section in one of his books, which is called The Spiral Curriculum. So, the question is the spiral curriculum necessary? Do you get better learning if you do something and do it again a bit later? Often you don't. And therefore, the spiral curriculum is a waste of time, because you're spending time on stuff that could be left till later without any degradation of the learning. The reason it gets more confusing today is because people are now understanding the value of what's called distributed practice. And so in Bruner's idea, the spiral curriculum, you probably revisit things every year. But with distributed practice, you come back in a couple of weeks or 3 weeks. So I think we need to be clear about what we're spiraling and why, and look for the empirical evidence. Does spiraling help? Or is it better just to do it properly when the child is ready? Those aren't easy questions to answer, but I think that the classic example in mathematics is matrices. So multiplying matrices is quite technically tricky. So what we often see is students being introduced to addition of matrices, which is very straightforward. And you see textbooks coming up with these incredibly contrived contexts for adding matrices. And the problems that they are claiming to solve are not problems you need matrices for. They're just getting students used to the idea. And this whole idea of getting students used to this, I think, is a very dangerous reason for including things in the curriculum. If you can leave it without harming the adult the child will become, leave it. Do the stuff that's really important to get right now. Then I think we'd have a really parsimonious curriculum, and one that sets students up to be successful.
Yeah. And one of the things, like, you were in the Netherlands in 2018, and I still remember that you talked about that learning sequences. So you always say learning sequences are local, and there's rarely one right order to teach things, even in mathematics. And you have also said that the grand historical sweep, like Stone Age, Romans, Vikings, that works neither for how children learn nor as history. And so I think it's kind of an interesting concept is how you would, like knowing what you know today, is how you would structure history for like low achievers and high achievers. What could that look like?
I think history is very interesting because it has these two dimensions of facts and processes. So when I was a university rector, I used to work with lots of different departments. And the thing that always intrigued me was historians, world-class historians, would often say, not my period. These are brilliant historians, but they don't know enough about the details of that particular period to say what's going on. So you need to know the facts, but you also need to understand cause and effect and chronology and reconciling conflicting documentary sources. So here's my proposal. First of all, we need to be clear about what it is that you need to know to be an informed citizen. So each country needs to say, you are ignorant if you don't know about this. The history of your country, how the Netherlands came to be, how, 1066 in England, the invasion, the Battle of Hastings. You just need to know that stuff because it's part of being an informed citizen. But there are also things about how history is done. And so I would choose topics for the younger children where the kind of historical processes are much easier to operationalize. So I quite like the solo taxonomy, which is a way of thinking about what's the sophistication that student's work shows. And so we might take the outbreak of World War I. What was the cause of World War I? Well, if a student says the attack on Pearl Harbor, well, they've got the wrong war. It's clearly incorrect. If they say the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, well, that's part of it. That was certainly a trigger. But that's only one reason. If they can see that there are multiple causes, like militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism, then they're giving a more sophisticated response. They're saying these four separate things. If they can then see how these different things, like imperialism and nationalism, interacted, they're moving up to another level of sophistication, which the inventors of the solar taxonomy, Biggs and Collis, call relational. So not just multi-structural, but relational, understanding the relationship between these things. And so this idea of progression as becoming more sophisticated with the same information, I think, is another important dimension of getting better at history. So it comes down to this very simple idea. When somebody gets better at history, what is it that gets better? And part of it is being able to argue more powerfully and to describe and explain historical events, but also having a greater range of periods that you can speak authoritatively on. So just getting those two dimensions right and thinking about what gets better when a student gets better at history. And the real problem with the grand sweep is that when students are doing the very early stuff, they're not really doing history because we have records from those early times. So we are in prehistory. So it's a really silly idea to start there because it's not really what history is about.
And so if I have this correctly, you sat on a panel that scrapped England's attainment levels. Is that something that you did?
Yes. I was one of the ones who, yes, there were two of us who were really against them. And the other two are kind of okay about it. but it was one of the worst things I've had to do in my life, actually. Because I don't know if you know this, but the original 10-level structure, later became 8, was based on the work that I and Margaret Brown had done on graded assessment in the 1980s. And it's what my PhD was about. And we argued that if you had an A, B, C, D scale at each age students were assessed, students who were Ds when they were 7 would be Ds at the age of 11 and 14 and 16. And I was very taken by the work of Carol Dweck. So we suggested, why don't we put every child on the same ladder? You might be in a different place from me, but in another year, I'll be up on the next rung of the ladder. So I will never think of this achievement as being who I am. It's just where I am. And with more effort, more progress, I'll be at a higher level. And so that's why the work that we've done was able to convince 3 other members of the panel that Paul Black chaired in 1987 to adopt this very strange structure. But the reason I argued against it was that the government inspectors, called Ofsted, were going to schools and looking to see how many children made 3 levels of progress in a particular time period. So the levels were designed 1 every 2 years. So over 4 years, you could expect to make 2-year levels of progress. How many kids are making 3 levels of progress? Well, the problem with that is the more smart kids you've got in your school, the more kids are going to be making 3 levels of progress, because smarter learners learn faster. So what we showed is that the average progress was 1 level every 2 years. For the bottom 10%, it was 1 level every 3 years. For the highest achievers, you actually make 1 level of progress in about 1.3 years. So the more smart kids you've got, the better you're going to look. And so because schools are being evaluated with this completely inappropriate metric, even though I had defended this structure every time it had come under attack. So Ron Deering did 2 big reviews of this, and I submitted evidence saying that, yes, it's not perfect, but it's better than the alternatives. In the end, I felt that we had to get rid of it because it was being used so inappropriately and basically penalizing schools that were in areas that attracted lower achieving students. It was just completely dysfunctional. And so it did feel like killing my babies, but I felt it to be done to actually allow the system to develop.
Yeah, so in the Netherlands, it's probably more open-ended. So we do, like, we're free to follow students the way we like.
Yeah.
But I think with a new curriculum, you always have to question, how are we going to monitor progress? And how is the inspectorate going to, see what good schools are or not good schools are? So what are your ideas on how we could approach that in the Netherlands?
I have to say,
if at all.
I'm torn. So I quite like the idea that in restaurants, in most places, they just give them a certificate of satisfaction. We're not going to have 3 different levels. We're going to just say, yeah, this restaurant is safe. It's fine. And it's giving cause for concern, then we'll do something about it. So, one approach to a school inspection is to say there's satisfactory and there's not satisfactory, and leave it at that. We're not going to try to work out who the excellent schools are. Another approach is to use the approach they used in Catalonia, which is to make school self-evaluation the focus of the inspection. So in other words, the inspectors come in and they ask the senior leaders in the school about what's going on. And all the inspectors are allowed to do is to verify the accuracy of the self-assessment, which I think is a very good way of building capacity within the school for future improvement. So as long as the school knows where it is and knows where it's weak and knows where it's strong, it's given a passing judgment. So I think that's got a lot to say for it. But now the more I think about it, the more I think that not having any kind of common system across the country is probably helpful. In other words, the more you actually have the same system, the easier it becomes to produce a judgment that really doesn't reflect any school well, but it looks neat and tidy. So I want to make the job harder for the school inspectors to compare different schools, because schools are doing different things with different students, with different parents, with different contexts. And so I would like to see the school inspection becoming almost like a coaching visit for the school leaders to help them clarify, prioritize, and decide what they're going to do over the next, say, 5 years. So the idea is, you come in and you ask, what do you want to achieve over the next 5 years? What evidence are you going to bring about your improvement? And how can we help?
Yeah, so that sounds really good. And I think in a lot of ways, that's how the Dutch inspectorate works. So, but we had a situation where the inspectorate basically talks to boards. So the board does the self-evaluation for all the schools, but then they didn't visit any schools. So, and I think that makes it quite hard to actually see if the self-assessment is working. Because if you don't see what the actual primary process is in schools, then you don't really know whether the board members are self-evaluating as they should. So now we've seen like a more of a push for the inspectorate to also go into schools. But if it's, I think maybe you could even add more like sources to see if the self-evaluation is working, like more peer evaluation or other things. So
Absolutely.
yeah.
So I mean, for me, I think not visiting the school is a bit like, those kinds of cabinets they use for handling radioactive material, where the researcher puts their hands into these two big gloves and they're feeling something at a second remove, and they never get the feeling for what they're actually doing. And I think that for me, the school inspectors ought to visit the school just in the same way that a good quantitative analysis would actually look at qualitative features as well, just to round out the picture. So I would be against school inspectors judging individual teachers, but I would be certainly in favor of school inspectors visiting the school, looking at the data they're collecting, just seeing whether the sense they're getting from the school's reports is mirrored on the ground. And we could round that out with student surveys, for example. You can round that out with parent surveys to get a complete picture. So you could actually have a kind of 360-degree appraisal for a school to round out the picture. But ultimately, I think I want humans making integrated, evaluative judgments about the school's processes, and maybe advising the boards about priorities in the future, or just saying, yeah, you seem to be on the right track. Your plan for the next 5 years looks good. Go for it. So it's just seeing that kind of improvement over time, I think. It's really important. I think a general principle in education is don't collect data more often than things are changing. So, don't keep on testing kids if they're not learning anything. So test them when there's likely to be a difference in the answers you get. And so for me, once every 3 to 5 years is about right. And you can then hope that the system is working. You might put in some safeguards, some kind of remote monitoring. You might have a light sample survey, for example. You might use data like PISA or TIMSS or things like that to just to provide an additional perspective on these data. But I really don't think that you're going to get anything useful if you try to make it more systematic, more quantitative than that, particularly in a system like the Netherlands, where there's already a considerable degree of autonomy at the school level. And, the Netherlands has one of the most completely developed voucher systems in the world, because the government sees its job as to pay for education, but not necessarily to provide it. And so having a single perspective on a diverse system like that, I don't think makes any sense at all.
I have another question. And it's a question that's just on my mind, so it's a bit off topic, but I want to ask it anyway. Is because you have done so much research and you have read so much research, and I was just wondering, like, with all the literature that you've read and studied, is there a research question that is being overlooked about assessment or AI in assessment or something completely else? Is there a topic, is there an overlooked research question that you think that we should, get a grip on and focus on?
I think the answer is probably no, but let me tell you why I think that. So for me, I think the real problem with doing any kind of educational research is it only allows you, even when it's done well, it only allows you to compare the control group with the experimental group. It doesn't allow you to compare, to make conclusions about all the schools that were not involved in the research. And we must remember that the control group is not representative of all the schools that were not part of the experiment. Schools that agree to participate in experiments are different from schools that do not agree to participate in experiments. So I think we often, feel that if the control group did worse than the experimental group, then this will work everywhere. We don't know that. The other problem I think that really bugs me is we're still evaluating categories rather than products. So we're doing meta-analysis on the effects of collaborative learning, for example, without any idea of what we're putting into the box called collaborative learning. So I think we need to focus much more on evaluating programs. So like the program that Siobhan Leahy and I developed, embedding formative assessment, we know that the same 2 DVDs were sent to each one of the 70 schools participating. They were given exactly the same advice, and therefore we don't know how the thing had its effect, but we know exactly what the intervention was. It was sending these DVDs. And I think we need to move towards a situation in which we actually experiment with replicable, standardized designs of interventions, so that if it does work, we know exactly what it was that worked, because then we can begin to scale it. And the other thing I would say is, and this is counterintuitive to many schools, I want schools to innovate in a way that is capable of being evaluated. So most rectors, most teachers, that they're in a hurry. They want their students to do well. And so if you've got this new idea, then you do it with all the 7th graders, which means that you can never work out whether it was successful or not. So I think the idea that schools should become inquiry domains where they innovate in a way that's potentially researchable. So you might do some new program with half of your 7th graders and not do it with the other half. You might do it, for example, using a new teaching approach for the odd numbered chapters in the textbook, and use the old approach for the even numbered chapters in the textbook. And then you can look at the students' test scores. Did they do better on the odd numbered chapters questions? So just the idea of getting into that research frame of mind, it's never going to be a randomized controlled trial, but at least you give yourself a chance at learning something from your innovation efforts. Because right now, schools don't get that chance. They innovate in a way that is not capable of being evaluated, and therefore you just don't know whether it worked or not.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dylan, for this wonderful conversation. I've had a lot of very interesting insights, and we look forward to welcoming you in the Netherlands in October.
Looking forward to it. Thanks.